from Rabbi Kevin, teacher. Go for it.
Okay. So I want to dedicate this share, if possible, to my cousin's dad who passed away yesterday. Markovitz, Mordechai Elau Ben Liba. I don't know his dad's name, but that's his mom's name. But anyway,
Markovitz.
Yes, yes. Did you know him?
I was a guy that worked for him in Israel.
Joking, in Herzliya. You're serious? Okay, we'll have to talk about that, Arthur. It's a small world. My mom and his wife, or my mom and his wife's mom, my grand and his wife's mom were sisters. Arthur.
Oh wow.
Okay.
That's
weird. We'll talk about that, Arthur. Shall I go weiter, like with my teeth, Arthur?
Yeah, hold on a second. I'm just going to get the catch.
Sure.
We're continuing now with Muktzah. Muktzah Mechamat Chesron Kis, which means Muktzah determined by financial, as well. Kis actually means pocket. Okay, and there's 2 points. There's 2 points here with an example. This refers to an item which is reserved for a particular weekday purpose, not permitted on Shabbos. The owner protects it from depreciation, damage, or becoming soiled, and preserves it for one purpose exclusively. For example, a surgeon's or shoichet's knife, a writing pad, a fax roll, let's look at a ream of paper, musical instruments, non-food merchandise for sale, purchased items to be returned to a shop, delicate items such as stereo equipment. The designation of muktzah under this category does not necessarily depend on monetary value, but on the owner's estimation of its importance.
Interesting.
For example, a dressmaker who uses her scissors exclusively for dressmaking during the week may not move her scissors on Shabbos, but a dressmaker who handles her scissors for other reasons besides dressmaking during the week may move and use the scissors on Shabbos for a permitted purpose, such as cutting grapes. A trader who sells tablecloths and does not use the merchandise for personal use during the week may not move or use them on Shabbos. But one who sells fruit and normally eats from his goods during the week may handle and eat from them on Shabbos. Okay, so...
Great rule of thumb to know what you do there.
Gavin, I learned from Kevin teaching us every day. There's halachas I don't know. I learned them,
but you can't remember everything. You know
no, but I learned them in 2004. In 2006. And I forgot some of them. I really did.
Yeah.
And there's just a short, quick one here.
Yeah.
Before, because and another one is newly formed items. One may not move any item which did not exist or which was not accessible for use at the start of Shabbos. For example, eggs laid or milk produced by cows on Shabbos, fruit that fell from trees on Shabbos. So you can't. Let's just see. So you can't move them because they had to have been available before Shabbos.
Okay, we've got to stop there because you're training at 7:30. Am I right, Kev? So we don't have much time, and you're going to be unavailable. So we've got to cover as much ground. You taught me a fortune, but thank you very, very much. All right, so guys, I'm going to share my screen with you with the new Mishnah we've dealing with. This Mishnah is exciting because we obviously gaining a little bit of territory and ground. Just give me 1 second. Okie dokie. Arthur, I haven't asked you in a while. Would you mind reading for us? Can you see properly?
I'm going to get my glasses. Just give me a second because the screen's small. I can't see Jack. Just give me a minute. I've seen my lenses quickly. You surprise me, you say, okay, let's do it. Just give me some tissue. Sorry, Kat, didn't step on you.
So Arthur says, I can't see Jack. And when my brother doesn't have his glasses on, he says to me, I can't see Jackie. That's his wife.
It's a different. Is it a benefit not to see someone, or is it a benefit to see someone?
I think, in a way, it's a benefit not to. Let me tell you why. I've got this theory. It's interesting is that as your body goes when you're older, your eyesight goes so you don't see the horror that's in the mirror.
Exactly.
That's my theory.
Exactly.
Why didn't you?
Okay, that's good to know that.
What, Kabb? Sorry, man.
Okay, it says, if one digs a pit. Okay.
All right.
Okay, ready?
Start again.
Okay. Mishnah. Okay, take 45. Mishnah. If one digs a pit in a public domain and an ox or a donkey falls into it, he is liable to pay for the damages. Whether one digs a pit, a ditch, a vault, squared off pits, or wedge-like pits, he is liable to pay for the damage that the excavation does. If so, why is specifically a pit mentioned in the Torah? Is it to teach the following? Just as a standard pit has sufficient depth to cause death, being 10 tefachim deep, so too for any obstacle that has sufficient depth to cause death, which is 10 tefachim, one is liable. If any of the excavations were less than 10 tefachim deep, and an ox or a donkey fell into it and died, the digger is exempt. But if the animal was merely injured by falling into the excavation, the digger is liable.
Excellent, Art. Excellently read. So, guys, I just want to give you an idea. In Shmot, Exodus chapter 21 to verse 33, that's mentioned in this, right? We did this in the 49th daf, okay? And what it deals with is when you're dealing with an ox or a donkey, those are not the only creatures which you're liable for if your pit damages someone else's animals. Why did it mention the ox or the donkey in the Chumash? Because these were the main workhorse animals that would carry heavy loads. And it's Art, can you put yourself on mute, please? Because of the background noise. Okay, so it's optimum, guys, that ox or donkey is mentioned because it's your workhorse animal and it carries things like utensils. So then we find out halachas of are you liable for utensils, etc. And also, what you've got to bear in mind is that they stammer a lot more than, for example, dogs or creatures that are a little bit more nimble on their feet. And also, an ox or a donkey was an extremely expensive animal when you're dealing with liabilities. So the Torah, we mention it because it's in the Torah, and the Torah's base reality is on what's the most common animals used at the time. Okay? So, do any of you know the difference between in the Torah, it obviously mentions classically in Shmot 21, chapter 21, it mentions a bor being a pit. Do you know the difference, guys, between, Arthur, you can answer this too, pit or a ditch or a vault or a squared off pits do any of you guys, or wedge-like pit, do you guys know what the differences are? Can I explain it to you?
No, go ahead and explain, I think.
All right. So when you have a pit is circular, right? So that was used most commonly as a water cistern. So it had to be 10 tefachim deep, because if you look at how a well is designed, a well is a pit. It's generally round. You draw your bucket in, and it has to be deep in order of 10 tefachim to contain that water. But the problem is that at that sort of depth, it's lethal. So that's why, because of the lethal aspect, and that's the verse in the Chumash, not for injury, for death. Injury is extrapolated from, but the biblical verse is about death of the animal. Agreed, guys? So that's why it mentions a pit, because it's used mainly for a well, which is round in shape, rather small opening, and even throughout, and that's why it has to be 10 tefachim. That's why it's a classical case of depth. Now, what you call a shicha is a ditch. A ditch is long and narrow. Now, what would you use a ditch for, guys? If you hear in the mafia movies, I'm going to leave him in a ditch. What does that mean?
To bury like a grave.
Yes, you're going to bury him alive. Exactly.
But a ditch on the side of the road.
Listen, in South Africa, potholes on the side of the road. Ditch is a colloquial word we use today. But the classical description of a ditch, nobody ever says in these mafia movies, I'm going to leave you in a pit. They say, I'll leave you in a ditch. Because a ditch is the specific term for a long and narrow trench that's dug specifically for coffins, etc. And it's exactly 6 foot, which, believe me, I'm sure is about 10. What do you call it? I'm sure it's 10 tefachim. Now, ma'ara with an iron is a vault. Do you know what it is? Do you know what a vault looks like, guys? I'm not talking about how many locksmiths over here. I'm talking about what was the biblical version of a vault. Because they have no locksmiths. There's no locks. How would they hide stuff then?
Like in the dungeon, in the basement or what? Wasn't it?
Yeah, look, a vault generally is like that in that it's square. We have a vault today. When you put stuff in a vault, it's generally square because it's the most practical shape, and it's covered with a roof, the vault in those days, and it has a specific opening. Why? So that most people wouldn't see that you've actually buried wine or treasure or something like that. So it would be covered with a roof so that nobody could see something valuable was in there. Does that make sense, guys? But it has an opening where you can stick your hand in and open it up in order to put the trapdoor so that people could walk over it, but it wouldn't necessarily, it has to be generally stable enough that it doesn't fall through. Otherwise, anybody could end up finding it. You walk with your friend, he disappears, you find treasure. Your friend might not be around, but you've got treasure to help you recover. So a vault is a square pit, generally square all round in terms of depth, width, and breadth. It's cubic meter, basically, and it has an opening and a cover of a roof. It's got to look like the area around it so you can hide stuff. Fine. Now, does anybody know what charitzin is?
Yeah, squared off pit.
Correct. And what's the difference?
No, I have no idea. I'm just reading it.
You doing what?
Between a vault, squared off pit, between a vault and a squared off pit.
Yeah, I'm saying, how did you know a charitzin was a squared off pit? Because you're reading the word, the English, the Aramaic.
Yeah, the English, because it was the next in line. You just finished both. Yeah.
Correct. Well, it is, Gavin, for somebody that's had the second shot, you're bloody awake. Well done, but so all right.
I'm
right. So, Gavin, let me cover some ground. I don't have much time. So charitzin is a squared off pit. Guys, the only difference between a vault and a squared off pit is you're not trying to hide anything valuable in a squared off pit. You could stick anything in there.
Won't have a ceiling or something.
It won't have a roof. That's exactly it. It doesn't have a ceiling, etc. Now, ne'itzin is a wedge-like pit. Do you know what that is? Rashi gives a description. Guys, do you know what it is? Mm-hmm. So, Kevin, you know what a wedge is? It's like an upside-down pyramid. So when you're digging a hole, it's easier to dig it broad in the beginning, and then you run out of steam. So it kind of narrows as you're going down. You with me? It narrows. So think of a pyramid upside down. That's a wedge. It's like a funnel. And sometimes people would dig that because with a borehole, you end up getting water at the bottom, and then you can just fill it with water. So it's quite a broad base at the top to draw water, and then it can go quite deep. But the top part is much broader. Think of it like an upside-down pyramid or a funnel. You get it? So anyway, guys, all these excavations were commonly dug in earlier times. They didn't exactly have refrigeration and water on tap. Okay. So now, what was I going to say to you guys? All right. So obviously it mentions all of these factors for obvious reasons. Let me just explain to you one of the things to bear in mind. Now, let me just see if I've got some more notes on Rashi. Just give me a second. All right. So I want you guys to bear in mind that it says if an obstacle is less than 10 tefach deep, you are exempt. Okay? Now you're exempt from what, guys?
From death.
Liability. Correct.
Okay.
You're exempt from liability. Correct, Kevin. But there's two different opinions. This is interesting. The one opinion says you're exempt from that extra cost that it would cost you for death. And the other opinion is stating that you're actually even exempt for injury. Now, I find that difficult to believe because they say that it's an unusual mishap if it causes the animal's death. Okay? But then I would say that you're liable for injury. But there are opinions that says you need not even pay the portion of the damage that might have been expected to occur. That's from the Meiri, but it's very difficult to understand what that means. Does that make sense, guys? I would think, by pure logic, that what we're talking about is if it's less than 10 tefachim, you're responsible for the injury portion, and if it's more than 10 tefachim, you're liable, or 10 or more, for the death. It can't be that suddenly, because it's 10 tefachim, that the animal fell in and never died, that you're not responsible for the injury. It doesn't make sense to me. Okay. And I'm not arguing with that opinion. Meiri is a genius, but he must have a reason that I have no knowledge of. Does that make sense? The Gemara discusses the basis of the digger's liability. Rav said, concerning the pit, for which the Torah made the digger liable, okay, is that it made him liable because of the pit's foul air. What do we mean foul air? Which he brought into being, and not because of the impact of the fall into it. So we see that Rav holds that that with respect to the injuries caused by the impact, or the death that was caused by the impact, we say it was the ownerless ground of the earth that damaged the victim. Therefore, obviously, Rav doesn't hold one accountable. So what we're saying is, if an animal falls in a pit, its death or injury can be caused by either two things, guys: the impact or the fall, or the foul air inside it. What do we mean, the foul air? So the air itself could be toxic. So miners, etc., especially in South Africa, you know, that they have to wear equipment so they're not breathing in the dust. I don't know if you know, there have been legal cases lately with asbestos mines.
Asbestos, yeah.
Yeah. So the minute things get into your lungs and they stick into your pulmonary cavities, that's the beginning of the end. So the combination of those factors can either kill you, either the impact of the fall, the foul air, or a combination of both. So Rav basically maintains that the Torah holds the digger liable because the digging of the pit he brought basically an accumulation of foul air that contributed to the animal's death. But he's saying you're not liable simply on account of causing the animal to suffer a blow, as explained by Rashi. Why? Because the ground is ownerless. And it was the ownerless ground that damaged the victim. So what does this mean? Is that the digger is not liable for damage done by a ground that he does not own. Who does, in your opinion, Rav seem to mimic? Which Tana? Guys, we did it in the last stuff, earlier in this stuff, actually.
Tana Kamma?
Guys, Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva calls it the owner of the pit must make restitution. Whereas Rabbi Yishmael said the owner of the pit means the one who needs to stand up and take ownership of the hazard he caused. It doesn't mean you have to physically own it. So again, Rav is reiterating the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, and Shmuel is reiterating the opinion of the rabbis and Rabbi Yishmael. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah, no, sorry. I've not spoken to that I couldn't answer.
So basically, when an animal falls into a pit that one dug, the reason you're liable is not because he caused it to trip and fall against the ground, since there's no liability for groma. Groma means indirect damage. So what do we mean indirect? Is that you're responsible if Shimon hits Reuven, he's liable. That's direct damage. If Shimon's ox damages Reuven or Reuven's ox, he's liable. Why is he liable? Because it's his property. But if you're holding according to Rabbi Akiva and Rav, where the pit in the public domain is not your property, then it's indirect. You never caused it. The only thing that you could be responsible for is that the earth that you dig up that created this sort of foul toxicity where you're breathing in fumes and those particles are sticking to your lungs. Does that make sense? We actually learned that in the 29th stuff. So Rav basically, guys, maintains that the Torah can only treat the foul air like the digger's property because that's what he brought into being. But the ground at the bottom of the pit is considered hefker, it's ownerless, because it was always there. Digger merely exposed it, but he can only say that if the damage is done in your own property, that the impact would play a part. Okay, so that's the opinion of Rav. Shmuel said the Torah made the digger liable because of the pit's foul air, and certainly also because of the impact of the fall. So again, Shmuel doesn't hold only the impact of the fall. He says foul air and the impact of the fall, whereas Rav says it's just the foul air. Okay? So why does he hold like that, guys? Why do you think?
What? Both the foul air and the falling.
And
makes more sense. Makes more sense to go for both.
You ask because the Rabbi Yishmael and the general rabbinic opinion is that it's about being responsible for the hazard you create, and therefore you manually created the drop. That drop that somebody falls through was brought into being through you, and obviously the turmoil and the dust and everything else, or the foul air, you also brought into being. So Shmuel rejects the reasoning that the digger owns the bore just because he brought something new into existence. So he rejects Rav's opinion that it's only the foul air, obviously. Okay. As far as that's concerned, that's pretty easy to know. But there's a discussion. The discussion is as follows. It says, and if you will argue that the Torah said he is liable only because of the impact of the fall in the pit and not because of the foul air, I would respond. Who do you think is responding here? In other words, the question is as follows. The Gemara is saying, guys, perhaps you're going to reason that since the foul air came into being indirectly, because the digger's not liable on account of it, it came up by natural means, but he's only responsible on account for the impact. This is a question on Shmuel. He's saying, why does Shmuel not only hold the foul air, but also the fact that, according to Rashi, about the actual damage? Okay. And the reason being is the Torah here in the verse, it actually testifies, guys, about liability over a pit. And it says in the Gemara, when you read this, you should have been a little shocked because it doesn't make sense. So I'm going to explain it to you. It says the Torah testifies about liability over a pit, even when it's filled with wads of wool, in which case there's no damage through impact. Clearly, then the Torah did not impose liability because of the foul air. did impose liability because of the foul air. So what do we mean, guys? Wads of wool or cotton wool or whatever the case may be? When does the Torah ever mention that? How did you understand it?
A soft landing. I took it literally.
Correct. And where does it come from that it mentions soft landing?
You got me there. I have to wait for your answer.
Okay, well, Gav, it doesn't mention it at all. So this is what it's saying. All it says here, okay, is that in that verse in Shmot, it states without any qualification that if you dig a pit and you leave it uncovered, you're liable to pay if an ox or donkey falls in and dies. So from that inference, you can see that there's liability whenever you leave it uncovered. It doesn't matter if the bottom is padded with cotton wool, blankets, and the animal isn't killed by the impact. If it happens to die in your pit, you're liable. So if the impact wouldn't kill it, what would kill it?
Foul odor.
Exactly, the foul air. I'm using the word air instead of odor because odor refers to a smell. Air refers to particles of solidity that are toxic, that are encased within it, that when breathed in can stick to your pulmonary cavities. You get the difference, not just a bad smell. It actually can affect your ability to breathe, like the asbestos mines, exactly as Kevin said. But basically, clearly the Torah imposed liability because of the foul air as well. So therefore, Rav and Shmuel don't have a disagreement with regards to the foul air. They said there's no qualification in the mention of the verse. So, yeah, it could definitely the air itself could be toxic. So the Gemara is now going to examine the dispute. What's the practical difference between Rav and Shmuel? Okay, we're going to go through a practical case. There's a practical difference between them. If you take a case, guys, regarding where one made an elevation in the public domain and an animal ascended in that elevation, fell off and died. Why? Because according to Rav, you're not liable for damage by an elevation that you created. Why? Because there's no foul air between the elevation and the ground below. And where's the impact? On ownerless ground, where the animal lives or dies. Okay? Because it's the ground that caused the death, not your contraption that you own. The ground, the drop, the sudden stop, that caused the death. And since the ground is in the public domain and ownerless, you're not liable for that. That's according to Rav. But according to Shmuel, he says that basically you're liable even for the damage of impact. If you create an elevation and the animal climbs up and falls off, you're liable for that as well. And Rav said, no, you're not. Why? Because there's no foul air. You haven't dug anything up. You've actually created a scaffold. So if there's no foul air and the animal dies and you're dying the animal's dying on ownerless ground, are you liable, guys, according to Rav? No, but according to Shmuel, you are. Why?
Because it doesn't make a difference. You're hitting the ground. And
correct.
Because it's based on ability, based on liability, based on ownership.
Correct. So what he's saying, no. Shmuel doesn't base it on ownership. He bases it on liability, that you have to take responsibility. You said the word ownership. So let's use the word ownership of responsibility, like your word liability is perfect, versus ownership of the hazard. So that's perfect, Gav. Perfect. All right. So let's go on. Just one thing that you got to bear in mind is that, look, both Rav and Shmuel would hold the digger liable if the animal fell in a private domain. There's no issue. But there's an issue that Rav would actually say that even if the animal got split open at the bottom, and then clearly it looks like impact, that the foul air contributed to its death, meaning that the infection set in or whatever the case may be, and if it contributed to the animal's death, there's a whole discussion in the Gemara, is that what killed it, the impact, or was it the foul air that prevented it from recovering? Are you with me? So the one part of the argument is, if it caused part of the damage, then why should you be liable? Remember, there was a discussion in Sanhedrin where there were people that consecutively beat a person to death. There were like 9 people, 10 people. And one, do you hold the last one liable, or do you say they're all exempt because they all contributed, or the final person was the one that did it, but with the 9 others, his wouldn't have been lethal? So it's the same sort of discussion here. Are you paying because it partially caused the injury or not? Look, it doesn't matter. If it was a factor, you're still liable if it created the final tickets for the animal. That's the bottom line. Okay, that's according to both Rav and Shmuel. But clearly, impact does play a role. So, right. So if we look at the scriptural source here, and we say that, look, there are 2 other practical differences, and we're going to state this here, is that if you look at Rav's reasoning, it says, if a man shall uncover a pit and an ox or a donkey shall fall into it. The expression that's used in the scriptural verse in Shmot says shall fall implies that the digger is not liable. Why? Because unless the animal falls in the normal manner of falling, which is head first, with the head landing in the deepest portion of the pit, you are not liable. Okay. Accordingly, we learn that the basis for liability is the animal's breathing of the foul air of the pit. Okay, I'm just going to repeat this. What's Rav's reason? Is that it states, if a man shall uncover a pit, etc., and an ox or donkey shall fall into it. So that expression shall fall implies that it's not the digger's fault. Okay, it's kind of indirect. Okay, but if the animal falls in a normal manner, head first, there's liability. So what do we mean here? What's the simplest way of doing it? Is that you can say, guys, there's another practical difference. If the animal fell in head first, where it broke its neck, but it never swallowed any foul air, clearly Rav would say in that case an animal died, there's no liability, whereas Shmuel would say there is liability. But if the animal died where it did breathe in the air, or its organs were exposed to the foul air or the dust or the particles, etc., in that case, both would hold liability. Does that make sense? That's one of the practical differences. So what is Shmuel's rebuttal? It said, according to Shmuel, the expression "and shall fall" connotes any matter of falling, even feet first, where the damage cannot be attributed to the animal's breathing of the foul air, but only to the impact. So what it's saying is that the bottom line is the dispute between Rav and Shmuel. We're looking at a case where it's a pit in public property, and basically the animal falls against the earth. And if it's in public property, it's ownerless, that it doesn't belong to the digger. But if it's in your own domain, Rav would say you'd have to pay. If, interestingly enough, guys, remember, it was discussed in 28b, that if you bring in a stone, a knife, or burden, and something that did belong to you, even if you declare it ownerless, you're still liable for the impact. As long as, if you remembered in the 28th daf, if the person slipped on it, but they landed on the ownerless ground, Rav says you're not liable because you landed on the ownerless ground. But if you slipped on it and landed on that article itself, then you're liable. Does that make sense? Remember, we covered that. Guys?
Yeah, I agree.
Right. So it's pretty straightforward. So the only difference between them is that if you can take the foul air out of it, call it instant death on impact. Shmuel says you're liable, Rav said you're not. If there's any contribution of the foul air where the animal could have breathed it in, both hold you liable for that too. In other words, it's still you have to pay either way. So the Gemara is going to bring a challenge to Rav. We learned in the Mishnah, why is specifically a pit mentioned in the Torah? It's to teach the following. So just as a standard pit has sufficient depth to cause death, right? Being 10 tefachim deep. Why did we mention a pit? Because we said, guys, originally a pit was done as a water cistern. And if it's not very wide like a well, it's not going to have sufficient water. Now, why would they dig it deep and not wide? Evaporation. That's the essence of it. So if you see these movies with Jack and Jill, did you ever see that there's a cover on top of a pit? I mean, on top of a well. You know, there's that lever that with the rope and the bucket, and you wind it up and down to get water, and you have that canopy, that like little Zozo hut on the top of a well. Why? Because if you're dealing in the desert, the water's going to evaporate. So what you want, guys, is like this, right? You want a long pit where the water stays cool, and you want a smallish opening enough to get like reasonable buckets in. And you don't want one bucket, because you don't want everybody sitting there with one bucket in a thing. You need reasonably people to work simultaneously together. It wasn't like COVID time, social distancing. So you could take your buckets, but you still don't want it to be too much in terms of evaporation. And those wells had the roof to stop. So the thing of it is, we're saying that of course is going to be 10 tefachim deep, because that's sufficient to create water so that you don't have to keep refilling the well, and there's no evaporation and heat, etc. So what's the point of this Gemara? Is it saying, look, there's a challenge to Rav. So we learn in the Torah, that's the classical view, it's a pit. It's sufficient depth to cause death, 10 tefachim. So too, it mentions in our Mishnah, any obstacle that has sufficient depth to cause death, which is 10 tefachim, you're liable. So, okay, that makes sense according to Shmuel. Why? Because so too, for any obstacle, etc., can be also understood to include an elevation. In other words, if it's talking about every sort of hazard, then the case that we learned where you build an elevation as an obstacle, that there's a drop. Shmuel, you covered. He says you pay an impact. It's not just foul air. You're fine. But then according to Rav, how do you answer the question? Because how can you include any other obstacle? Why? So the Gemara answers on behalf of Rav. It includes squared off pits and wedge-like pits. And the Gemara objects. It says, look, squared off pits and wedge-like pits are mentioned explicitly by the Tana early in the Mishnah. Why are we alluding to them here? The Gemara responds, because it wants to teach you that you're liable for even squared off pits or wedge-like pits. And then he explains where the law is derived. So let me just add a little bit of context of what we mean. Is that you could have said that, in other words, the Gemara mentions the Mishnah. This part of the Gemara has a question, and it says, listen, it also talks about squared off pits and wedge-like pits, because it's the least similar to an ordinary pit. Why is it the least similar, guys? Well, it doesn't have to be 10 tefachim deep, because you're dealing with a broad base of liquid or storage, broad. So which means if it's a wedge like this, guys, if it's a wedge that's coming in, just look at the screen.
Yeah.
Yes. Then it doesn't have to be this long, thin drop. So it's not going to be 10 tefachim deep necessarily. So, I mean, you don't have such a problem because one can still die, but you might not have the same level of foul air. Why? Because foul air is when you're under a mine and you can't breathe and you need equipment so you don't get asphyxiated, right? But in an area where it's open, where that air can evaporate, bear in mind, the animal could have fallen a month after you dug the hole, Kev, a month. So that air had plenty of time to evaporate. So according to Rav, you don't have to pay. According to Shmuel, you still pay an impact. So the Gemara is mentioning these other things because you also have to pay for liability because it's the least like the bor in the Torah. And it's saying anything that you create as a public hazard, that has a certain amount of depth and breadth, etc., even if it doesn't resemble a long, thin, round pit, such as a square pit, a vault, you're liable for. Okay, whether it's impact or foul air or whatever the case may be. So that's why the Mishnah is here to mention other excavations that wasn't mentioned in the Pasuk and the Torah, okay, as far as that's concerned. So it says, why mention them again? Because we're basically saying that we're mentioning this law because you're liable is that no matter, even if it resembles a standard pit, if it's 10 tefachim deep and the animal falls in, you're liable. It doesn't matter if it's not what's mentioned in the Torah of a classical pit. Anything 10 tefachim deep that you're liable for. So again, the question is going to arise, but if we don't cover based on impact, what does it matter if the animal died and you're saying it's the foul air, if the drop and the impact didn't kill it? How does Rav say you're liable? In other words, because of that particular height. So we're going to get to that particular issue.